The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the sting of sand and the promise of another merciless day. The year was 1870, and the sun hung low in the October sky, casting long shadows across the weathered landscape. Mountains loomed in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the approaching winter. Samuel McKinnon stood on the porch of his ramshackle ranch house, squinting against the harsh light. At 43, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had lived too long under the unforgiving sun and carried too many burdens in his heart. His calloused hands gripped a tin cup of bitter coffee as he surveyed his modest spread 50 head of cattle, a handful of horses, and miles of nothing but sagebrush and loneliness. The townsfolk in Bitter Creek, some 15 miles east, called him Silent Sam, not out of affection, but from a mixture of fear and disdain. They whispered about the man who had ridden into their valley 5 years ago with nothing but a horse, a gun, and shadows in his eyes. Some said he was running from the law back east. Others claimed he'd killed a man in cold blood. The truth was something Samuel kept locked away, buried deeper than any grave. He lived alone by choice and by circumstance. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away, and that suited him fine. His only companions were his animals and the ghosts that visited him in the dark hours before dawn. The ranch house, built with his own hands from rough-hewn logs, stood as a monument to his self-imposed exile. Inside, it was sparse: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, though only one was ever used, and a stone fireplace that fought a losing battle against the prairie cold. Samuel drained the last of his coffee and set about his morning routine. The cattle needed to be moved to the eastern pasture where the grass was still green near the creek. It was a task that would take most of the day, but he welcomed the work. Labor kept the memories at bay, kept him from thinking about small hands that would never again reach for him, about a woman's laughter that existed only in dreams. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Brutus, and began gathering the scattered herd. The cattle were ornery, as they always were when asked to move. But Samuel worked with the patient efficiency of a man who had nowhere else to be. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to darken his worn shirt despite the cool autumn air. It was near midday when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the prairie. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or perhaps a wounded animal caught in the brambles near the creek. But as Brutus picked his way down the rocky slope toward the water, the sound became clearer. It was rhythmic, desperate, like something trapped and fighting for freedom. Samuel dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. 5 years of solitude had made him wary of anything unusual. The creek gurgled peacefully, its waters running clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves turning gold in the autumn chill. And there, caught against a fallen log near the water's edge, was a burlap sack. It was large, the kind used for grain or potatoes, and it was moving. Samuel approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the river stones. The sack jerked again, and this time he heard it clearly. A muffled sob, weak but unmistakably human. His blood ran cold. In all his years in the territory, he'd seen terrible things done by terrible men, but this— Then came the voice, barely a whisper, strained and desperate. "Please open it. I can't breathe." It was a woman's voice, and the sound of it struck him like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities. This could be a trap. Road agents were known to use all manner of tricks to lure unsuspecting travelers. But what road agent would choose this desolate spot, miles from any trail? The sack moved again, weaker this time, and a thin wail joined the woman's plea, the unmistakable cry of an infant. Samuel's hesitation shattered. He dropped to his knees beside the sack, his fingers working at the rope that bound it shut. The knots were tight, swollen with moisture from the creek spray. He pulled out his knife and cut through them with urgent sawing motions. "Hold on," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if the woman could hear him. "Just hold on." The rope parted, and he pulled open the mouth of the sack. What he saw inside made him rock back on his heels. his breath catching in his throat. A woman lay curled in the cramped space, her body wrapped protectively around a baby that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Her dress, once fine blue calico, was torn and stained. Her dark hair hung in matted strands around a face that might have been pretty if not for the bruises that mottled her cheek and jaw. Her arms, thin to the point of frailty, held the infant with fierce determination even as her own strength failed. The baby's cries grew louder as fresh air reached them, and the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were green, like sage leaves after rain, and wild with terror. She tried to speak but only managed a hoarse croak. "Easy now," Samuel said, reaching in to help her. She flinched away from his touch, pressing herself deeper into the sack, her arms tightening around the child. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, holding up his hands to show they were empty. "But you need to get out of there. Both of you." Those green eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for cruelty. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Samuel reached in again, slower this time, and helped her struggle out of the sack. She was lighter than he expected, as if hunger had hollowed out her bones. Her legs buckled the moment she tried to stand, and he caught her before she could fall. The baby wailed louder, its tiny face red with indignation and need. "My horse is just there," Samuel said, nodding toward Brutus, who watched the proceedings with calm disinterest. "Ranch ain't far. You need food, water, and rest." The woman's lips moved, but no sound came. Her eyes, however, spoke volumes. Gratitude mixed with wariness, desperation tempered by a mother's fierce protective instinct. Samuel looked at the sack, then at the creek. Someone had thrown her away like refuse, had tried to dispose of both mother and child as if they were nothing more than unwanted goods. The thought kindled a cold anger in his chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He helped her to Brutus, lifting her into the saddle with careful hands. She swayed dangerously, and he quickly swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to hold her steady while she clutched the baby. The woman tensed at the contact but had no strength to protest. As they rode slowly back toward the ranch house, Samuel's mind churned with questions. Who was she? Who had done this to her? And why did the simple act of helping her feel like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into dangerous light? The woman's head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fevered heat radiating from her body. The baby had quieted to occasional whimpers, exhausted by its own crying. Behind them, the empty sack lay by the creek like a discarded chrysalis, evidence of a cruelty that even the harsh frontier rarely witnessed. Samuel McKinnon, who had sworn never again to involve himself in the troubles of others, found himself riding home with two souls whose lives now rested in his calloused hands. The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds dancing across their path, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, a lonesome sound that seemed to herald the end of his carefully constructed solitude. The ranch house had never felt smaller than when Samuel carried the woman through its weathered door. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through the single window, illuminating the sparse interior, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with a few tin goods, and his narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It was a bachelor's dwelling, functional but devoid of comfort, and suddenly he was acutely aware of its every shortcoming. He laid her gently on the bed, the corn husk mattress crackling under her slight weight. She hadn't released her hold on the baby, even in her semi-conscious state. The child's thin wails filled the small space, a sound that seemed to awaken something long dormant in the timbers of the house itself. Samuel stood for a moment, uncertain. It had been 5 years since he'd had anyone in his home, 5 years since he'd had to consider another's needs. He ran a hand through his graying hair and forced himself to think practically. Water first. He filled a basin from the barrel by the door and found a relatively clean cloth. When he approached the bed, the woman's eyes snapped open again, that same wild fear flickering in their depths. "Just water," he said, showing her the basin. "You need to drink." She watched him warily as he wrung out the cloth and offered it to her. When she made no move to take it, he carefully pressed it to her cracked lips. She sucked at it greedily, her throat working as she swallowed. Some color returned to her pallid cheeks. The baby's cries grew more insistent. Samuel had seen enough newborns on the ranch to know that cry hunger, pure and simple. But what could he offer? He had no milk, save what he could get from the goats. "I'll be back," he told the woman, though he wasn't sure she understood. "Gotta get some milk for the little one." Outside, he caught the gentlest of his nanny goats and milked her into a clean pot. The task brought back memories he'd tried to bury. Another woman, another baby, another life that had crumbled like sand between his fingers. He pushed the thoughts away and focused on the present need. Back inside, he faced a new problem: how to feed an infant without a proper bottle. He searched through his meager possessions until he found what he needed: a piece of clean cloth. He soaked a corner in the warm milk and offered it to the baby. The woman watched him with those green eyes, suspicion warring with desperate hope. When the baby latched onto the milk-soaked cloth and began to suck, her body sagged with relief. "That's it," Samuel murmured, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Easy does it, little one." As the baby fed, he studied the woman more closely. Beneath the dirt and bruises, she had fine features, high cheekbones, a delicate nose. Her hands, though work-worn, showed signs of having known better days. This was no saloon girl or frontier drifter. This was a woman who had fallen from someplace higher. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Her lips moved, but only a whisper emerged. He leaned closer. "Margaret," she breathed. "Margaret Calloway? And the baby?" "Rose." The word was fierce with maternal pride. "Her name is Rose." Samuel nodded. "I'm Samuel McKinnon. This is my place. You're safe here." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she seemed too exhausted to shed. They said I was property. Said Rose was born wrong, born in shame." Her voice broke. "My husband's family, after he died, they—" "You don't have to tell it all now," Samuel said. "Rest first. Talk later." But Margaret seemed compelled to continue, as if the words had been dammed up too long. "They wanted me to give her away. Said no decent family would have us. When I refused," she touched her bruised face, "they paid men, told them to take us far away, dispose of—" Her voice failed entirely then, but Samuel understood. In the territory, women had few rights, especially women without male protection. A widow with a child, at the mercy of powerful in-laws, might as well be cattle to be sold or discarded. He felt that cold anger again, harder this time. "They won't find you here," he said, and meant it. The baby had fallen asleep, milk dribbling from her tiny mouth. Samuel set aside the cloth and watched as Margaret adjusted the child in her arms, every movement speaking of a love that transcended exhaustion and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. He busied himself with building up the fire, uncomfortable with gratitude. The evening was drawing in, and the temperature would drop fast once the sun set. He put water on to boil for coffee and considered his limited food supplies. There was cornmeal, some salt pork, dried beans, and not much else. It would have to do. As he worked, he was aware of Margaret watching him. He could almost feel her cataloging every movement, every gesture, trying to determine if he was friend or just another kind of foe. He didn't blame her. Trust came hard on the frontier, especially for a woman who'd been betrayed by those who should have protected her. The coffee boiled, filling the cabin with its bitter aroma. He poured a cup and offered it to her, along with a piece of hardtack he'd softened in water. "It ain't much," he said apologetically. She took the cup with shaking hands, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "It's everything," she said simply, as she ate and drank. Samuel found himself really looking at his home for the first time in years. The layer of dust on every surface, the cobwebs in the corners, the general air of neglect. This was no place for a woman and baby, but it was all he had to offer. "There's only the one bed," he said awkwardly. "You and the baby take it. I'll bed down by the fire." Margaret's eyes widened. "I couldn't—" This is your home, and you're my guests," he said firmly. "That's how it's done proper." Something in his tone must have convinced her because she nodded, a flush creeping across her cheeks despite her exhaustion. Night fell like a curtain across the prairie. Samuel fed the fire and laid out his bedroll on the hard floor, his joints protesting the arrangement. From the bed, he could hear Margaret's breathing gradually deepen into sleep, punctuated by the occasional small sounds from Rose. He lay awake, staring at the fire-painted ceiling. What had he done? His carefully ordered life, his self-imposed exile, all shattered by a moment's compassion. Come morning, decisions would need to be made. The woman and child couldn't stay here indefinitely, but neither could he turn them out. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. From the bed came a soft whimper, not the baby, but Margaret, caught in some nightmare. Without thinking, Samuel rose and moved to the bedside. Her face was twisted in fear, sweat beading on her forehead. "Shh," he said softly. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here." Her eyes opened, unfocused with sleep and terror. For a moment, she didn't seem to know where she was. Then recognition dawned, and with it, a fragile kind of peace. I'm sorry," she whispered. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied. "Rest now. I'll keep watch." She studied his weathered face in the firelight. "Why are you helping us? You don't know me. I could be anyone." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Maybe because I've been where you are," he said finally. "Different circumstances, but lost all the same. Someone should have helped then. No one did. Figured maybe this is a chance to balance the scales some." Margaret reached out tentatively and touched his hand where it rested on the bed frame. Her fingers were cold but steady. "Thank you, Samuel McKinnon. Whatever happens come morning, thank you for tonight." He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and returned to his place by the fire. But sleep eluded him. Instead, he kept vigil through the long hours, listening to the breathing of the woman and child who had invaded his solitude, wondering if perhaps loneliness wasn't the protection he'd thought it was, but just another kind of prison. When dawn finally painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Samuel McKinnon realized that his life of careful isolation had ended the moment he'd cut open that burlap sack. What would replace it? He couldn't yet say. But as Rose's hungry cries broke the morning stillness, and Margaret stirred to tend her, he found himself almost looking forward to finding out. Word travels fast on the frontier, faster than tumbleweeds in a dust storm. Within 3 days, the entirety of Bitter Creek knew about the woman and baby at Silent Sam's ranch. How the news spread was a mystery. Perhaps a passing rider had spotted smoke from the chimney at unusual hours. Or maybe the wind itself carried whispers across the sage. Samuel first realized their secret was out when he rode into town for supplies. The general store fell silent the moment he pushed through the door. Jake Morrison, the proprietor, looked up from his ledger with eyes that gleamed with barely suppressed curiosity. "Sam," Jake said, drawing out the name. "Haven't seen you in near a month." "Been busy," Samuel replied curtly, moving to gather what he needed. Flour, coffee, canned milk for Rose, and some calico fabric that might serve for new clothes. "Heard you been extra busy," said Tom Garrett from his spot by the pickle barrel. The ranch hand's gap-toothed grin held no warmth. "Heard you got yourself some company out there." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he continued his shopping without response. "Must be nice," Tom continued, "having a woman's touch around the place, especially a young widow woman, from what we hear." The other men in the store chuckled, the sound ugly and insinuating. Samuel set his purchases on the counter with careful control. "That'll be $2.40, Jake said, though his attention was clearly on the drama unfolding rather than his arithmetic. As Samuel counted out the money, the store's door banged open. Clarence Donnelly strode in, followed by 2 men Samuel didn't recognize, rough-looking sorts with the bearing of hired guns. Donnelly owned the largest ranch in the valley and fancied himself something of a local baron. his pale eyes fixed on Samuel with predatory interest. "McKinnon," Donnelly said. "Funny thing, I got a wire yesterday from associates back in Missouri. Seems they're looking for a woman and a baby, offering good money for their return." Samuel's hand stilled on his coin purse. "That so?" "Indeed. Seems this woman, Margaret Calloway, they said her name belonged with her late husband's family. Ran off with property that wasn't hers to take." "The baby, you mean?" Samuel said, his voice flat. Donnelly shrugged. "Laws are laws. A woman's got no right to keep a child from its rightful guardians. These gentlemen here," he gestured to his companions, "are prepared to take her back where she belongs." Samuel straightened slowly, his hand drifting toward his hip. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Anyone sets foot on my land without invitation," he said quietly, "will be met with a Winchester rifle. That's the only law I recognize on my property." One of Donnelly's men, a scar-faced fellow with dead eyes, stepped forward. "You threatening us?" "Oh, man." "Stating facts," Samuel replied, "same as you might state that the sun rises in the east." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake Morrison ducked behind his counter, and Tom Garrett suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Donnelly raised a hand, checking his man. "No need for unpleasantness. McKinnon, we're all civilized men here. But you might want to think hard about harboring fugitives. Could bring all manner of trouble to a man's door." "I've had trouble before," Samuel said. "Still standing?" He gathered his purchases and walked out, feeling their eyes boring into his back. His hands were steady as he loaded his saddlebags, but his mind raced. They knew. Worse, they had legal backing, however corrupt it might be. In the territory, possession was 9/10 of the law, and women were often considered possessions. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every movement in the brush could herald an ambush. But he made it home, unmolested, to find Margaret in the yard, hanging washing on a line she'd strung between 2 posts. She'd regained some strength in the past days, though she still moved carefully, as if testing the limits of her recovery. Rose lay in a makeshift cradle Samuel had cobbled together from an old crate, sleeping peacefully in the shade. Margaret's face lit up when she saw him, then fell as she registered his expression. "What happened?" she asked. Samuel dismounted and told her about the encounter in town. With each word, her face grew paler, her hands twisting in her apron. "They found us," she whispered. "So soon, I thought we'd have more time." "They haven't found anything yet," Samuel said firmly. "Just heard talk, but we need to be ready." That night, he cleaned and oiled his rifle and pistol, checked his ammunition stores. Margaret watched from across the table, Rose nursing at her breast. "I won't go back," she said suddenly. "I'll die first, and Rose, I won't let them take Rose. No one's taking anyone." Samuel said, "I gave you my word you were safe here. I meant it." "But you don't understand," Margaret said, tears threatening. "My husband's family, the Calloways, they're powerful. They have money, connections. His brother James is a judge. They'll use the law against us." "Let them try," Samuel said grimly. "Law's one thing, enforcing it out here is another." The first test came 2 days later. Samuel was repairing a fence when he spotted riders approaching. 3 men, moving with the casual arrogance of those who expected no resistance. He leaned his rifle against the fence post where it could be easily reached and waited. The men reined in just outside what might generously be called his yard. Samuel recognized 2 of them from the store. The third was better dressed, with the soft look of a man who hired others to do his dirty work. "Mr. McKinnon," the well-dressed man said. "My name is William Hartley. I represent the Calloway family of Independence, Missouri. I believe you have something that belongs to my clients." "I have nothing that belongs to anyone but me," Samuel replied evenly. Hartley produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I have here legal documents granting custody of one Rose Calloway to her paternal grandparents. Her mother, Margaret Calloway, is wanted for theft and kidnapping. Theft of what? The child, of course, under Missouri law. Custody defaults to the paternal family in cases where the mother is deemed unsuitable. Samuel spat tobacco juice to the side. This ain't Missouri. The law reaches everywhere, Mr. McKinnon, even to this godforsaken wilderness. Behind him, Samuel heard the cabin door open. He didn't turn, but he knew Margaret was watching, probably with his old shotgun in her hands. He'd taught her to use it the day before. "You have your papers," Samuel said. "I have my rifle. Which do you think carries more weight out here?" Hartley's hired men shifted restlessly, hands moving toward their weapons. Samuel remained perfectly still, a lifetime of facing down predators having taught him the value of calm. "You're making a grave mistake," Hartley said. "We'll be back with the territorial marshal. This woman is a fugitive, and you're harboring her. That makes you a criminal as well." "Then I guess I'm a criminal," Samuel said. "Wouldn't be the first time someone called me that. Now get off my land before I decide to live up to the name." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hartley wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over. McKinnon, the law will have its way." They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats. Samuel waited until they were out of sight before retrieving his rifle and heading back to the cabin. Margaret stood in the doorway, the shotgun trembling in her grip. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "They will. I've brought this trouble to your door. Rose and I should leave. Find somewhere else." "Where?" Samuel interrupted. "Where would you go that they wouldn't follow? No, you're staying put. We'll face whatever comes." That night, as they sat by the fire after Rose had been put to bed, Margaret asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Why, Samuel, why risk so much for strangers?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Had a family once. Wife named Sarah, daughter named Emma. Fever took them both while I was away, trying to earn enough to give them a better life. When I came home," he swallowed hard, "I found them already in the ground. Neighbors said they called for me at the end, but I wasn't there." Margaret reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. "I'm sorry. Been carrying that weight for years." Samuel continued. "Maybe this is my chance to do right by someone. Maybe saving you and Rose balances the scales for failing Sarah and Emma." "You didn't fail them," Margaret said softly. "Life failed you all." They sat in companionable silence, hands touching, while outside the wind howled its lonely song across the prairie. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But tonight, in the circle of firelight, two wounded souls had found a moment of peace in their shared understanding of loss and the fragile hope of redemption. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance. The first storm caught them in late October, turning the prairie into a white wasteland overnight. Samuel had lived through many Wyoming winters, but this one felt different. Perhaps because now he had more than just himself to worry about. He taught Margaret the harsh mathematics of survival, how much wood they needed to last a 3-day blizzard, how to recognize when the animals were sensing bad weather coming, how to melt snow for water when the creek froze solid. She proved a quick study, her delicate hands growing calloused as she learned to split kindling and tend the fires that kept death at bay. "Hold the axe higher," Samuel instructed one gray afternoon, watching as she struggled with a particularly stubborn log. "Let the weight do the work, not your arms." Margaret adjusted her grip, brought the axe down, and split the log clean through. She looked up at him with such pride that he couldn't help but smile, an expression that felt foreign on his weathered face. "I did it." "You did," he agreed. "You're turning into a proper frontier woman." She laughed, a sound that seemed to warm the air around them. Rose, bundled in furs in her improved cradle nearby, gurgled in response to her mother's joy. The storm hit that night. The wind screamed like a living thing, driving snow through every crack in the cabin walls. Samuel had done his best to seal them with mud and grass, but the cold was relentless. They kept the fire roaring, burning through wood at an alarming rate. Margaret sat near the hearth, nursing Rose while wrapped in every blanket they owned. Samuel paced, checking the walls, the door, listening to the cabin groan under the assault of wind. "Will it hold?" Margaret asked, having to raise her voice above the storm. "Built her myself." Samuel replied, "She'll hold." But privately, he worried. The roof was taking a beating, and he could hear ice forming on the logs, its weight adding to the strain. He'd seen cabins collapse under such conditions, trapping or crushing those inside. Around midnight, they heard something different, a scratching, whining sound at the door. Samuel grabbed his rifle, motioning Margaret to stay back. "Could be wolves," he said. "Storm drives them to desperation." But when he cracked the door open, fighting against the wind, he found not wolves, but his old dog Buck, half frozen and whimpering. The animal had been ranging far, checking Samuel's trap lines, and had barely made it back. "Fool dog," Samuel muttered, dragging the ice-covered animal inside. "Should have known to come home sooner." They rubbed Buck down with old sacking, getting his blood flowing again. The dog curled up by the fire, tail thumping weakly in gratitude. Margaret smiled at Samuel's gruff tenderness with the animal. "You pretend to be so hard," she said softly. "But you're not, are you?" Samuel didn't answer, busying himself with adding more wood to the fire, but he felt her eyes on him, seeing past the walls he'd built around his heart. The storm raged for 2 days. They rationed their food, melted snow for water, and took turns keeping the fire alive. On the second night, with the wind howling like demons, Rose developed a fever. Margaret's composure cracked. "She's burning up," she said, fear making her voice sharp. "We need a doctor." "No doctor can get here in this," Samuel said, though the words tasted like ash. He'd seen frontier children die from lesser fevers, their small bodies unable to fight off what would barely trouble an adult. They did what they could. Cool cloths on her forehead, drops of water mixed with honey on her lips. Margaret sang lullabies, her voice breaking on the high notes. Samuel found himself praying for the first time in 5 years, bargaining with a god he'd turned his back on after Sarah and Emma died. Just before dawn on the 3rd day, Rose's fever broke. Her eyes opened, clear and bright, and she reached for her mother with a healthy cry. Margaret wept with relief, clutching the baby to her chest. Samuel turned away, ostensibly to tend the fire, but really to hide his own tears. The storm ended as suddenly as it had begun. Samuel pushed open the door to find a world transformed, pristine white drifts as tall as a man, the sun blazing in a crystalline blue sky. But with the beauty came danger. They were snowed in, cut off from town, and any help should trouble come calling. He set to work immediately, shoveling paths to the barn, checking on the animals. Many of the cattle had survived by huddling together, though he found 3 frozen carcasses that would need to be dealt with come spring. The horses were safe in the barn, though hungry and restless. Margaret joined him outside, Rose bundled against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from old shirts. "It's beautiful," she breathed, looking out at the snow-covered prairie. "Like the whole world's been made new, beautiful and deadly." Samuel warned. "This much snow means the passes are blocked. We're on our own until spring thaw." But Margaret wasn't listening. She'd set Rose down in a protected spot and was gathering snow in her hands, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Don't you dare," Samuel began, but the snowball caught him square in the chest. For a moment, he just stared at her, shocked. Then, surprising himself, he laughed, a rusty sound that seemed to startle the horses. He scooped up his own handful of snow. What followed was the most undignified snowball fight in the history of Wyoming Territory. They pelted each other like children, slipping and sliding in the drifts. Buck barked and jumped around them, adding to the chaos. Even Rose seemed to laugh from her safe spot, waving her tiny fists at the spectacle of adults at play. When they finally collapsed, breathless and covered in snow, Samuel couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so alive. Margaret's cheeks were red with cold and exertion, her eyes sparkling. For a moment, lying there in the snow, they just looked at each other. "Thank you," she said softly. For what? For reminding me that there's still joy to be found, even in the hardest places. That night, as they ate a meager supper of beans and cornbread, a comfortable domesticity settled over the cabin. Margaret had made small improvements. Curtains fashioned from old flour sacks, wild flowers dried and hung from the rafters. Rose's corner turned into a proper nursery with a mobile made from twigs and feathers. Samuel watched her move about the small space, tending to Rose, stirring the pot on the stove, humming softly. The sight triggered a pain so sharp it took his breath away. Not grief this time, but longing. This was what he'd lost, what he told himself he could never have again. You're staring, Margaret said without turning around. Sorry, he mumbled, focusing on his plate. She came and sat across from him, Rose drowsing in her arms. Don't be sorry, I just wondered what you were thinking. He set down his spoon, choosing his words carefully. Was thinking how natural you look here, like you belong. A blush crept up her neck. Do I belong? The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound usually meant nothing to Samuel, but tonight it seemed to underscore their isolation. Two people brought together by violence and chance, making something that might be a home. Yes, he said finally. You and Rose both, for as long as you want to stay. Margaret reached across the table, her fingers intertwining with his. What if we want to stay forever? Samuel turned his hand palm up, properly holding hers. Her skin was rough now from work, but warm and real. Then I reckon I'd need to add another room come spring. Growing girl needs her own space. She squeezed his hand, and they sat there as the fire burned low. Two people who had found each other in the wilderness, building something fragile and precious against the harsh backdrop of winter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside their small circle of warmth, hope had taken root. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the cloudless March sky when the riders came. Samuel woke instantly, a lifetime of vigilance triggered by the sound of horses approaching. Beside him, Buck growled low in his throat. He rolled from his bedroll by the dying fire, reaching for his rifle in one smooth motion. Through the window, he could see them, 6 riders, dark shapes against the snow-reflected moonlight, too many for simple travelers, too organized for drifters. Margaret, he whispered urgently. Wake up, take Rose to the root cellar. She came awake with a mother's instinct, already reaching for the baby before her eyes were fully open. They've come. Appears so. Remember what we practiced. They had drilled for this possibility during the long winter nights. Margaret gathered Rose quickly, wrapping her in blankets to muffle any cries. The root cellar, accessed through a hidden trap door beneath a worn rug, would keep them safe and concealed. Samuel watched her disappear into the floor, then pulled the rug back into place. He checked his rifle, his pistol, counted his ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but perhaps enough to make them think twice. The riders had stopped just beyond the yard, conferring among themselves. Samuel could make out Hartley's silhouette, and the 2 men from their previous encounter. The other 3 were new hired guns by their bearing, brought in for violence. McKinnon, Hartley's voice carried clear in the cold air. We know you're awake. Come out and let's discuss this like civilized men. Samuel cracked the door open, keeping the rifle visible. Nothing to discuss. I told you before, get off my land. I'm afraid that's not an option anymore. Hartley replied. I have here a warrant, signed by Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. You're harboring a fugitive and an abducted child. We're authorized to use whatever force necessary to retrieve them. Your paper means nothing out here. Samuel called back. And Judge Harrison is 3 days' ride away. One of the new men, a lean figure with a stance that spoke of violence barely contained, edged his horse forward. Enough talk. Old man's alone. We go in, take what we came for. Leave him bleeding if he resists. Try it, Samuel said, jacking around into the chamber. First man through that door gets a bullet. Second one, too, if I'm quick enough. Which of you wants to die for the Callaways' money?" The lean man laughed. An ugly sound. "You think you're some kind of hero? Old-timer. You're just a broken-down rancher who stuck his nose where it don't belong." "Maybe so," Samuel agreed. "But this broken-down rancher knows every inch of this land. Know where a man can ford up and hold off an army. Know where the snow's deep enough to swallow a horse and rider whole. You want to dance in my yard come daylight? We'll dance. But right now, in the dark, that's suicide, and you know it." There was truth in his words, and the riders felt it. The terrain around the ranch was treacherous for those who didn't know it. Ravines hidden by snowdrifts, ice-covered rocks that could lame a horse, approaches that left attackers exposed to fire from the cabin. Hartley spoke again, his cultured voice tight with frustration. "You're only delaying the inevitable, McKinnon. We'll wait for daylight if we must, but this ends tomorrow, one way or another." They pulled back, making camp just beyond rifle range. Samuel could see their fire, see them passing a bottle between them. Let them drink, he thought. Cold and whiskey would make them slow come morning. He waited an hour, then carefully lifted the rug. "It's safe for now," he whispered into the darkness. Margaret emerged, Rose miraculously still sleeping in her arms. Her face was pale but determined. "How many?" "6. They'll wait for dawn. Then we have tonight to prepare." They worked through the remaining hours of darkness. Samuel positioned ammunition at key points around the cabin, boarded up windows leaving only gun slots, filled every container with water in case they tried to burn them out. Margaret loaded weapons, her hands steady despite the situation. "I won't let them take her," she said quietly, checking the old shotgun. "I won't go back to that life. Rose deserves better. She'll have better," Samuel promised. "Whatever it takes." As the eastern sky began to lighten, they took their positions, Samuel at the front window with the rifle, Margaret at the side window with the shotgun. Rose, mercifully, slept on in her reinforced cradle, moved to the safest corner of the cabin. The attack came with the first true light of dawn. The riders spread out, approaching from multiple angles. Samuel tracked the lean gunman, clearly the most dangerous, through his gun sight. "McKinnon!" Hartley called from behind cover. "Last chance. Send out the woman and child, and you can go back to your miserable existence." Samuel's answer was a rifle shot that kicked up snow inches from Hartley's position. The battle was joined. They came at the cabin in a rush, firing as they rode. Samuel worked the rifle with methodical precision, forcing them to keep their distance. Beside him, Margaret fired the shotgun, the blast catching one rider's horse and sending both tumbling into a snowbank. But there were too many, and they were too professional. While Samuel was focused on the riders to the front, 2 men gained the side of the cabin. He heard them on the roof, trying to find a way in. "The chimney!" Margaret shouted. Samuel grabbed a burning brand from the fire and shoved it up the chimney, followed by damp wood that would create thick smoke. Cursing came from above, followed by the scramble of boots on icy logs. A window shattered, and a gun barrel poked through. Samuel fired instinctively, and a scream told him he'd found his mark. But more windows were breaking now, more guns appearing. Then Margaret cried out. A bullet had grazed her arm, sending the shotgun clattering to the floor. Blood seeped through her dress sleeve. "I'm all right," she gasped, but her face was white with pain. The lean gunman appeared at the main window, grinning. "Game's up, old man. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Give up now. Maybe we don't kill you." Samuel's rifle was empty. His hand moved to his pistol, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Outside, he could hear the riders regrouping for a final assault. That's when they heard it. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast from the east. Everyone froze, listening. "Who the hell?" the lean man muttered. Through the broken window, Samuel saw them, a dozen riders, moving with purpose. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider, Martha Chen, who ran the boarding house in Bitter Creek. Behind her rode other townspeople, the minister, the blacksmith, even Jake Morrison from the general store. "That's far enough," Martha called out. her voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing difficult borders. "Hartley, you and your hired thugs are trespassing on McKinnon land." "This is legal business," Hartley protested. "We have a warrant. Your warrant isn't worth the paper it's printed on." The minister, Reverend Walsh, spoke up. "We've sent word to the real authorities about your forged documents and hired kidnapping. They'll be here by tomorrow. You're interfering with— We're protecting our neighbor, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Eric Swenson. Cut him off. Man's got a right to shelter folks in need without hired guns shooting up his place." The tide had turned. Outnumbered now, Hartley's men looked uncertain. The lean gunman spat in disgust. "This ain't over, McKinnon. We'll be back." "No," Martha said firmly. "You won't. See, we did some checking on you boys. Wanted men, most of you. Sheriff and Laramie would be real interested to know where you are. You come back here. We make sure he finds out." One by one, Hartley's men mounted up. Hartley himself lingered, his face twisted with fury. "You people don't understand. The Callaways are powerful. They'll what?" Reverend Walsh interrupted. "Send more thugs. File more false papers. The whole town knows the truth now. Hartley, that woman and her baby are under our protection. You tell the Callaways that if they want to pursue this, they can do it in a real court, with real judges, in the full light of day." Defeated, Hartley wheeled his horse and followed his men. The townspeople remained until the attackers were specks in the distance. Samuel emerged from the cabin, hardly believing what he'd witnessed. "Why?" he asked simply. Martha dismounted, her weathered face kind. "Because it was right, Samuel. You've kept to yourself these 5 years, but we remember the man who helped dig out the Olson family after the avalanche, who gave his last cent to help the widow Patterson keep her farm. You're one of us, whether you know it or not." Margaret appeared in the doorway, Rose in her good arm, the wounded one roughly bandaged. The townspeople tipped their hats to her. "Ma'am," Reverend Walsh said, "if you and Samuel would like, I'd be happy to perform a proper marriage ceremony. Make things official, as it were. Harder for anyone to separate a legal family." Margaret looked at Samuel, a question in her eyes. He crossed to her, taking her gently by the shoulders. "Would you have me?" he asked quietly. "Broken-down rancher that I am. Would you have us?" she countered. "A woman with a past and a baby that isn't yours?" "She's mine if I say she is," Samuel said firmly. "Both of you are, if you'll let me claim you." Margaret's answer was in her smile, bright as the morning sun on snow. Around them, the townspeople cheered, and somewhere in the celebration, Rose added her own happy gurgling to the chorus. The sun climbed higher, warming the battle-scarred yard. The fight wasn't over. The Callaways might try again, but they wouldn't face just one man now. They'd face a community, a family, and a love forged in the crucible of Wyoming winter and tested by fire. The town of Bitter Creek had never seen such a spectacle. In the weeks following the standoff at the ranch, whispers turned to open discussion, and discussion became heated debate. The small community found itself divided, those who supported Samuel's right to protect Margaret and Rose, and those who believed in the absolute letter of the law, no matter how unjustly applied. The controversy reached its peak on a surprisingly warm April morning when the whole town seemed to gather at Morrison's General Store. What started as casual conversation quickly escalated into something more. "It ain't right," declared Josiah Whitman, a prosperous rancher who'd always envied Samuel's water rights. "A woman belongs with her rightful family. The law says a lot of things," Martha Chen interrupted, her voice sharp. "Doesn't make them all just, that woman was thrown away like garbage, left to die with her baby. Now you want to send her back to the people who did it?" the crowd murmured. Taking sides, Samuel and Margaret had come to town for supplies, unaware they would walk into this powder keg. As they entered the store with Rose, conversation stopped dead. Margaret's arm was still bandaged from the gunfight, but she held her head high. She'd gained weight in the weeks at the ranch, no longer the skeletal figure Samuel had pulled from the sack. Rose. now 3 months old, gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, pink-cheeked and healthy. "Well," Josiah said loudly, "here's the woman herself. Maybe she'd like to tell us why she thinks she's above the law." Samuel stepped forward, but Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'll speak for myself," she said quietly. She moved to the center of the store, every eye upon her. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "You want to know why I ran, why I took my daughter and fled in the night?" She shifted Rose to her other arm. "My husband, God rest his soul, died of pneumonia last summer. We'd been married 2 years. A love match, though his family opposed it. I wasn't from their social circle. You see, just a schoolteacher's daughter who'd caught their son's eye." The store was silent now, even Josiah holding his tongue. "After Thomas died, his family took everything. The house, the money, even my wedding ring. Said it was a family heirloom and I had no right to it, but I could bear all that. What I couldn't bear was when they told me Rose would be raised by them, and I would be sent away." "That's the law," someone muttered. "Grandparents have rights." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Rights? They called my daughter a mistake, said Thomas had shamed the family by marrying beneath him, and Rose was the proof of it. They planned to raise her to be ashamed of her mother, to never even know my name. And when I refused to sign the papers giving her up," she paused, her composure cracking slightly. "They locked me in the cellar for 3 days. No food. Just enough water to keep me alive. Said I'd stay there until I signed. When that didn't work, they paid men to take us both away, to dispose of the problem. As they put it." A collective gasp ran through the crowd. Even Josiah looked uncomfortable. "So yes," Margaret continued, her voice stronger now. "I took my daughter. I ran. And if that makes me a criminal in your eyes, then I'll wear that name proudly. Because a mother's first duty is to protect her child, not bow to unjust laws that treat women and babies as property to be disposed of at will." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the back of the store, came the sound of slow clapping. Reverend Walsh stepped forward. Brave words. Mrs. Calloway. And true ones. I think we've all heard enough to know where justice really lies in this matter. But Josiah wasn't finished. "Pretty speech don't change the law. There's still the matter of McKinnon here living in sin with another man's widow." Samuel's jaw clenched. But before he could respond, Reverend Walsh spoke again. "Actually, about that, Samuel and Margaret were married yesterday evening. I performed the ceremony myself, with Martha and Eric as witnesses. So there's no sin here, Josiah. Just a family trying to make their way." The news sent another ripple through the crowd. Margaret moved closer to Samuel, and he put his arm around her shoulders, a public claim that set tongues wagging anew. "Married?" Josiah sputtered. "Without even posting bans? Without the town knowing?" "Wasn't aware we needed the town's permission," Samuel said dryly. "Man wants to marry a woman. Woman agrees. Minister says the words, 'That's all the law requires.'" "It's disgusting," spat Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, Josiah's sister. "Barely a month since she appeared, and already married? What decent woman moves so fast? And you, Samuel McKinnon, taking in a woman with another man's child." "My child now," Samuel interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "Rose is my daughter in every way that matters. Any man or woman who says otherwise will answer to me." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. "Mrs." Hartwell stepped back, her face flushed. "You're making a mockery of propriety," she insisted. "What kind of example does this set? Women thinking they can just run off, take up with any man who'll have them." "The example," Martha Chen said firmly, "is that our community protects those who need protecting, that we judge people by their actions, not by the circumstances forced upon them. That's the example I want to set." The crowd began to shift, more voices rising in support of Margaret and Samuel. Stories emerged, other women who'd suffered under unjust laws, other families torn apart by those who valued property over people. Young Mary Patterson, barely 18 and recently married, spoke up with trembling voice. "If my husband were to die, God forbid, his family could take everything, could take my children. That's the law. Josiah admitted reluctantly. Then the law needs changing, Mary said with surprising firmness. The debate might have continued all day, but it was interrupted by the arrival of a stranger, a well-dressed man who dismounted from a tired horse and entered the store with the bearing of someone important. "I'm looking for Samuel McKinnon," he announced. Samuel stepped forward warily. "That's me." The man reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. "James Thornton, attorney at law, from Denver. I've been retained by the Women's Suffrage Association to look into this matter." Another shocked murmur. The suffragettes were known even in Bitter Creek, though their influence rarely reached so far into the territories. "It seems," Thornton continued, "that your case has attracted attention. The attempted kidnapping and false imprisonment of Mrs. Calloway as she was then, constitutes criminal acts that supersede any custody claims. I'm here to ensure that justice is properly served." He turned to address the crowd. "The Calloway family has withdrawn all claims and warrants. It seems they prefer to avoid the publicity a full investigation would bring. Mrs. McKinnon and her daughter are free to live as they choose, without fear of legal repercussion." The relief on Margaret's face was radiant. She sagged against Samuel, who held her steady, his own expression showing the first real peace anyone had seen there in years. "Furthermore," Thornton added, "I've been authorized to say that should this community require legal assistance in updating its local ordinances to better protect women and children, the association would be happy to provide guidance." The store erupted in conversation. Josiah and his supporters found themselves increasingly outnumbered as the tide of public opinion shifted. Even some who'd initially opposed Samuel and Margaret began to reconsider, faced with the reality of how easily any woman could find herself in Margaret's position. As the crowd debated and argued, Samuel guided his family outside. They stood on the wooden sidewalk, Rose blinking in the bright sunlight. "Is it really over?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe. "The legal part, maybe." Samuel said, "There'll still be talk, still be those who disapprove, but let them talk. We've got the law on our side now. And more importantly, we've got friends." As if to prove his point, Martha emerged from the store. "Don't mind Josiah and his ilk," she said. "They're outnumbered and they know it. This town's changing, and you two are part of that change." She cooed at Rose, who grabbed at her finger with chubby hands. "This little one's going to grow up in a better world than we did. Mark my words. A world where women aren't property and families are made by love, not just blood." That evening, back at the ranch, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains red and gold. Rose slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the battles fought for her future. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "for standing up in there, for claiming us so publicly." "Nothing to thank me for," Samuel replied. "Man stands up for his family. That's all I did." "Your family," Margaret repeated, tasting the words. "I like the sound of that." "Get used to it," Samuel said, taking her hand. "Because that's what we are now. No matter what anyone says, no matter what the law claims, we're a family." The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. But here on the porch of their modest ranch, 3 people who'd found each other against all odds were home. The courthouse in Bitter Creek was a modest wooden building that served multiple purposes: town hall, meeting place, and occasionally, courtroom. On this sweltering July morning, it was packed to capacity. People had traveled from neighboring settlements to witness what many called the trial of the decade, though in truth, it was a civil hearing regarding custody and property rights. Samuel helped Margaret from the wagon, both dressed in their finest clothes. Margaret wore a simple brown dress that Martha Chen had helped her sew, while Samuel had reluctantly donned his one good suit, saved for funerals and now, apparently, legal proceedings. Rose, now 6 months old and beginning to show her mother's delicate features, rested in Margaret's arms. oblivious to the gravity of the day. The Calloways had not given up as easily as Attorney Thornton had hoped. Through various legal maneuvers and considerable influence, they had managed to bring the case before a circuit judge, the Honorable Clarence Blackwood, known for his strict interpretation of the law and his lack of patience for what he termed frontier justice. As they entered the courthouse, Samuel spotted the opposition. James Calloway, his late brother's elder sibling, sat at a table with two lawyers from St. Louis. He was a thin man with cold eyes and an expression of perpetual disdain. Beside him sat Mrs. Eleanor Calloway, the family matriarch, dressed in black silk despite the heat, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "They came themselves," Margaret whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "Let them come," Samuel replied. "We've got truth on our side." Attorney Thornton met them at their table, his expression serious. "Judge Blackwood is traditional," he said quietly. "He'll follow the letter of the law. We need to prove not just that they treated Margaret poorly, but that they have no legal claim to Rose." The judge entered, a large man with mutton chop whiskers and a perpetual scowl. The crowd rose, then settled again as he took his seat. "We're here in the matter of Calloway versus McKinnon," Judge Blackwood intoned, "regarding custody of the minor child, Rose Calloway." "Rose McKinnon," Samuel said clearly. The judge's scowl deepened. "We'll determine that. Mr. McKinnon, Mr. Pemberton. You represent the Calloway family?" A smooth-faced lawyer rose. "I do. Your Honor, we contend that Mrs. Margaret McKinnon, formerly Calloway, unlawfully removed the child from her rightful guardians, under Missouri law, which applies as that was the child's birthplace. Custody of a minor defaults to the paternal grandparents in cases where the mother is deemed unsuitable." "And how is Mrs. McKinnon unsuitable?" Thornton asked. Pemberton smiled coldly. "She abandoned her home without notice, took up with a stranger of questionable reputation, and has shown a flagrant disregard for proper moral standards. Furthermore, she cannot provide the child with the advantages the Calloway family can offer: education, social position, financial security." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, but she remained silent as Thornton had instructed. "Your Honor." Thornton rose. "We dispute every characterization just made. Mrs. McKinnon didn't abandon her home. She fled unlawful imprisonment and threats to her life. She sought protection from Mr. McKinnon, whom she subsequently married in a legal ceremony. As for advantages, I would argue that love, safety, and freedom are worth more than all the gold in the Calloway vaults." For 2 hours, the lawyers argued back and forth. Documents were presented, affidavits from the men hired to dispose of Margaret and Rose, testimony from townspeople about the attack on the ranch, character witnesses for both sides. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Judge Blackwood called Margaret to testify. She took the stand with quiet dignity, Rose held firmly in her arms. The judge frowned. The child should be removed during testimony. He said, "With respect, Your Honor." Margaret replied, "Rose has not left my arms since the day she was born, save for when the Calloways tried to take her from me. I'll not be separated from her now." A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge's frown deepened, but he nodded curtly. "Tell the court," Pemberton began, his voice oily with false sympathy, "about your life with the Calloways. Were you not given shelter, food, care during your pregnancy?" "I was given a roof," Margaret said steadily. "In exchange, I was treated as a servant. I scrubbed floors until the day I gave birth. Despite the doctor's warnings about my condition, I was told daily that I was a shame to the family, that my child would be raised to forget I existed." "But surely that's better than the life you have now," Pemberton pressed. "Living in a crude cabin, doing manual labor, exposing your daughter to the dangers of frontier life." Margaret's eyes flashed. "In that crude cabin, I'm treated with respect. My husband sees me as a partner, not property. My daughter will grow up knowing she's loved for who she is, not molded into what others demand she become." Your husband, Pemberton said with emphasis. A man you married with unseemly haste. Tell me, Mrs. McKinnon, what do you really know about Samuel McKinnon? His past? The rumors about why he lives alone? Objection. Thornton called. Relevance. Goes to the character of the home environment, Pemberton replied smoothly. I'll allow it. The judge ruled. Margaret lifted her chin. I know that Samuel McKinnon is the kindest, most honorable man I've ever met. I know he saved our lives when others would have let us die. I know he's never raised a hand to me in anger, never spoken a harsh word without cause. What happened in his past shaped him, yes, into a man who understands loss and guards fiercely against it. That's the man I want raising my daughter. The crowd stirred appreciatively, but Judge Blackwood remained impassive. Eleanor Calloway was called next. She testified in clipped tones about the shame Margaret had brought to the family, the necessity of removing the child from her influence, the generous offer to raise Rose properly. And what would have become of Margaret? Thornton asked during cross-examination. Eleanor's lips thinned. She would have been provided for. We had arranged a position for her in domestic service back east, far enough away to prevent complications. In other words, you intended to separate a mother from her child permanently? For the child's benefit, Eleanor said coldly. Some women are simply not meant to be mothers. Blood alone doesn't make a parent. Indeed it doesn't, Thornton agreed, which is why Rose is fortunate to have found true parents in the McKinnons. The testimony continued. James Calloway spoke of family honor, of his brother's mistake in marrying beneath his station. Samuel testified about finding Margaret and Rose, about their life on the ranch, about his commitment to their family. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, it came time for closing arguments. Pemberton stood, adjusting his coat. Your Honor, the law is clear. Blood relations have primary claim, especially when they can provide superior circumstances for the child. Whatever sympathy we might feel for Mrs. McKinnon's romantic notions, we must consider what's best for the child. The Calloways offer education, refinement, opportunity. What can the McKinnons offer besides hard labor and isolation? Thornton rose for his final argument. Your Honor, there's an old saying, the letter of the law killeth, but the spirit giveth life. Yes, the Calloways are blood relations, but they're also the people who tried to have this woman and child murdered. They speak of opportunity and refinement, but what good are those things if they come at the cost of a mother's love? What advantage is wealth if it's built on cruelty? He gestured to Margaret and Samuel. These two people have built a family from nothing but love and determination. They've faced down hired guns, social censure, and now this legal challenge. Why? Because they believe, as I believe, that family isn't determined by blood or money, but by choice. Samuel McKinnon chose to save 2 lives. Margaret chose to trust him with her daughter's future. They chose each other, and that choice, Your Honor, should outweigh any claim based merely on blood. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Blackwood shuffled his papers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. This court, he began slowly, is charged with upholding the law. The law traditionally favors blood relations in custody matters. The Calloways began to smile. However, the judge continued, and their smiles faltered. The law also recognizes that the welfare of the child must be paramount. He fixed his stern gaze on the Calloways. The evidence presented here shows a pattern of cruelty and criminal behavior that shocks the conscience. Attempted murder, false imprisonment, conspiracy to kidnap. These are not the actions of fit guardians. Turning to Margaret and Samuel, his expression softened fractionally. While this court might typically frown upon hasty marriages and irregular circumstances, it cannot ignore the evidence of genuine care and protection offered by the McKinnons. The child appears healthy, well-loved, and thriving. He banged his gavel. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the defendants. The minor child, Rose, shall remain in the custody of Samuel and Margaret McKinnon. Furthermore, Any attempt by the Calloway family to interfere with this custody will be met with criminal charges. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Margaret sagged against Samuel, tears streaming down her face. Rose, startled by the noise, began to cry. And for once, Margaret didn't try to quiet her. It was the cry of a child who would grow up with her mother, in a home built on love rather than law. The Calloways stormed out, threatening appeals, but Thornton assured the McKinnons that no higher court would overturn such a clear ruling. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, the townspeople surrounded them with congratulations. Even some who had initially opposed them offered handshakes and kind words. "You did it," Martha Chen said, hugging Margaret carefully around Rose. "You stood up to them and won. We all won." Margaret replied, "Every woman who's been told she has no rights, every family that's different from what others expect, we all won today." That evening, as they rode home to their ranch, Samuel was unusually quiet. "Finally," Margaret asked, "what are you thinking?" "Thinking about what that lawyer said." He replied, "About choosing family. Reckon that's what we did, isn't it? Chose each other?" Margaret shifted Rose to one arm and took Samuel's hand with the other. "Best choice I ever made." "Mine too," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere ahead, their little cabin waited, no longer a bachelor's retreat but a true home. They had faced down the law and won, not through violence or trickery, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over convention, family over blood, and courage over fear. The dawn broke gentle and golden over the Wyoming prairie, painting the grassland in shades of amber and rose. Samuel stood on the porch of the cabin, now expanded with a new room he'd built with his own hands, watching the sun climb above the distant mountains. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of sage and the last wildflowers of the season. Behind him, he heard Margaret soft humming as she prepared breakfast. Through the window, he could see her moving about the kitchen, their kitchen, with the easy grace of someone who had found her place in the world. Rose, now walking on unsteady legs at 14 months, toddled after her mother, babbling in the language only she understood. It had been a year since that terrible night when men had come with guns and papers, trying to tear their family apart. A year since the trial that had legally bound them together. But as Samuel watched the morning unfold, he knew that no court decision had made them a family. They had done that themselves, choice by choice, day by day. "Coffee's ready," Margaret called softly, appearing in the doorway with 2 steaming cups. Samuel accepted his with a grateful nod, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Such simple intimacy still sometimes caught him by surprise. The casual touches, the shared glances, the comfortable silences that spoke louder than words. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Margaret asked, settling beside him on the bench he'd built for just such mornings. "Thinking about time," Samuel admitted. "How, a year ago, I couldn't imagine this. Couldn't imagine being anything but alone." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about Sarah and Emma." Samuel stiffened slightly. He told her about his first family during one of their late-night talks, but Margaret rarely brought them up, respecting his pain. "What about them?" "I think they'd be happy," she said simply, "knowing you found peace, knowing you're not alone anymore." Samuel's throat tightened. "You think so?" "I know so. Love doesn't die. Samuel, it just changes shape. The love you had for them led you to save Rose and me. In a way, they're part of our story too." Before Samuel could respond, Rose toddled out onto the porch, her chubby arms raised. "Pa, Pa," she demanded. Samuel set down his coffee and swept her up, his heart swelling as it did every time she called him Pa. Not by blood, perhaps, but by something stronger, by choice, by love, by the daily act of showing up. "Look at you, little wildflower," he said, settling her on his lap. "Getting bigger every day." Rose grabbed at his face with sticky fingers, and Margaret laughed. She's been into the honey again. They sat there, the three of them, watching the ranch come alive with the morning. The cattle lowed in the distance, the chickens pecked around the yard, and Buck, old now but still loyal, dozed in a patch of sunlight. "I have something to tell you," Margaret said suddenly, a note in her voice that made Samuel look at her sharply. She was smiling, but there was something tremulous about it, something that spoke of momentous news. "What is it?" he asked, concerned. Margaret took his free hand and placed it on her stomach. "Rose is going to have a brother or sister come spring." For a moment, Samuel couldn't breathe. A child, their child, not brought to them by tragedy and chance, but created by their love. Are you sure?" "Martha confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. That's why I was gone so long." Samuel pulled her close with his free arm. Rose sandwiched happily between them. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, and he could hear the vulnerability in her voice. "Happy?" Samuel's voice was rough. "Margaret, I don't have words. After Sarah, I never thought I'd have this again. Never thought I deserved it." "You deserve all of it," Margaret said firmly. "We both do. We've earned our happiness. Samuel fought for it, bled for it, chose it every day. This baby, it's our promise to the future." Rose, perhaps sensing the emotion of the moment, patted both their faces with her honey-sticky hands. "Love Mama, love Pa," she declared, her vocabulary having expanded considerably. They laughed, the tension breaking. Samuel stood, still holding Rose, and helped Margaret to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside. I want to hear everything Martha said, and we need to start planning. Another room to build, supplies to lay in." "Samuel McKinnon, planning for the future," Margaret teased. "Who would have thought?" As they moved toward the door, horses appeared on the horizon. Samuel tensed automatically, his free hand moving to where his gun usually hung. Old habits died hard, but as the riders drew closer, he relaxed. It was Martha Chen and Reverend Walsh, with what looked like half the town strung out behind them. "What in the—" Samuel muttered. The group rode into the yard, dismounting with much laughter and chatter. Martha approached, beaming. "Did you tell him?" she asked Margaret. "Just now," Margaret confirmed, blushing. "Tell me what?" Samuel asked, looking between them suspiciously. Martha laughed. "The whole town knows about the baby. Margaret's been glowing like a lantern for weeks. So we decided it's time for a proper celebration, a harvest festival, right here at your ranch, to celebrate the season, your family, and the future." "I don't know," Samuel began, his hermit instincts flaring. "Samuel McKinnon," Martha said sternly. "You're part of this community, whether you like it or not. You stood for us. We stood for you. That makes us family, in a way, and family celebrates together." Throughout the day, the ranch transformed. Tables appeared as if by magic, laden with food brought by every family. Musicians tuned their instruments, children ran wild through the yard, and the women gathered around Margaret, offering advice and congratulations. Samuel found himself surrounded by men he'd barely spoken to before. Ranchers, shopkeepers, drifters who'd settled down. They talked cattle and weather, shared stories of their own families, welcomed him into their circle as if he'd always belonged there. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Reverend Walsh called for attention. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We're here to celebrate many things. The harvest, yes, but also the triumph of love over law, of choice over convention. A year ago, this family was tested by fire. They stood firm, and in doing so, they showed us all what courage looks like." He raised his glass of cider. "To Samuel and Margaret McKinnon, to young Rose, and to the new life that will join them come spring. May their story remind us that families are made not just by blood, but by the bonds we choose to forge and the love we choose to share. Hear, hear." The crowd shouted, raising their own glasses. Samuel stood. Margaret beside him with Rose in her arms. He looked out at the faces surrounding them, some who had supported them from the start, others who had come around, all now part of the tapestry of their lives. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice carrying in the still evening air. "But I reckon I need to say this. A year ago, I was a man alone, by choice and by circumstance. I'd built walls around my heart so high I thought nothing could breach them. Then Margaret and Rose came along and showed me those walls weren't protection. They were a prison." He put his arm around Margaret. "We've all seen hard times out here, lost people we loved, dreams that died, hopes that withered like grass in a drought. But we've also seen something else, that people can choose to be better than their circumstances, that love can grow in the harshest ground. That family isn't about who you're born to, but who you stand with when the storms come." His voice grew stronger. "They said we were wrong. A broken man, a desperate woman, a baby who didn't belong to us both. But look around. This is what we built from that wrong. A home, a family, a community that stands together. If that's wrong, I don't want to be right." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Music struck up, fiddles and guitars, and a somewhat out-of-tune piano someone had hauled from town. People began to dance, spinning and laughing under the stars that were just beginning to appear. Samuel and Margaret stood apart for a moment, watching it all. Rose had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted by the excitement. "Look what we made," Margaret said softly. "From such dark beginnings." "No," Samuel corrected gently. "Look what we chose. Every day, we chose this, chose each other, chose to fight, chose to hope." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around both her and Rose. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, but it seemed distant and unimportant. Here in the circle of light and laughter, surrounded by community that had become family, they were safe. The party continued late into the night, but Samuel and Margaret eventually slipped away, carrying the sleeping Rose to her little bed. They stood together in the doorway of her room, watching her sleep by the light of a candle. "She'll have a good life," Margaret whispered. "Both of them will. Different from what we knew, but good. Better than good." Samuel agreed. "They'll have choices we never did. They'll know they're loved not in spite of who they are, but because of it." They made their way to their own room, the sounds of celebration still drifting through the windows. As they prepared for bed, Samuel caught Margaret's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving. For being brave enough to stay. For this." He gestured to encompass everything, the house, the child sleeping down the hall, the new life growing within her. Margaret smiled, that smile that had first begun to thaw his frozen heart. "Thank you for opening that sack by the river, for choosing to see us as people worth protecting, not problems to be avoided, for becoming the man I knew you could be." They held each other in the darkness, two people who had found light in the most unexpected place. Outside, the last of the partygoers headed home, calling cheerful good nights. The ranch settled into peaceful silence, broken only by the eternal wind across the prairie and the distant lowing of cattle. As sleep began to take him, Samuel thought about the morning to come, and all the mornings after that. There would be challenges. There always were on the frontier, but they would face them together. This family forged by choice and strengthened by trial. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the expanded cabin, the well-tended yard, the thriving ranch. It illuminated a place that had once housed only loneliness and regret, but now sheltered hope, love, and the promise of tomorrow. In the smallest room, Rose stirred in her sleep, perhaps dreaming of the brother or sister who would soon join their circle, in their bed. Samuel and Margaret held each other, no longer two broken people seeking shelter, but partners who had built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. And somewhere in the vast Wyoming sky, the stars looked down on it all, on this unlikely family, this chosen love, this proof that even in the harshest landscape, the human heart could find a way to bloom. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you enjoyed this story of love, courage, and the true meaning of family, please let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to connect with fellow lovers of Western romance. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more heartwarming frontier stories. And share your thoughts on Samuel and Margaret's journey. What touched your heart the most? We can't wait to hear from you.